Alright, hello and welcome back. This is going to be my preview post for the second round of the Elements World Championship. So first things first, we are going to talk about the rules for this round. Each of the 4 players in a group will play each of the other 3 twice, once home and once away. In any given match, the 12 elements will be divided, 6 to each player. The element draft works like this. The home player first chooses 2 elements to assign to each player, then the away player chooses 1 element to assign to each player. Then the process repeats. Again, the home player assigns 2 elements to each player, and the away player chooses which direction the final 2 elements are split. In so doing, each player has 6 elements. The home player obviously has a significant advantage, but that's why you're playing every other player in your group twice, once home and once away. This round, all of the matches are best of 7, and like last round, you cannot use an exact combination of elements more than once. You can use each element up to twice. And shards count as 3 upgrades, and you're allowed to use 4 times the game number of the current game as the number of upgrades you're allowed to have in your deck. This, however, has 2 interesting changes to the previous round. The first is that you're only allowed to use 2 monos over the course of a match, and the second is that you are allowed 1 quote-unquote free match, whereby you may play any deck with the correct shard and upgrade rules in the slot for that game. If, for example, you use your free game on game 3 of a match, you're allowed up to 12 upgrades, with shards still counting as 3 upgrades. You are additionally entitled to a single game over the course of all 6 of your matches, being replayed with the exact same decks after the game. This is intended as an anti-RNG rule, basically allowing a player to get back 1 win where they had a counter but lost to really bad RNG. There's some interesting potential applications here involving tactical wins, both for and against, if a player discovers a tactic based on the opponent's deck, and overall serves as at least a little bit of a nerf to decks that rely on surprise. But on the whole, it does allow for some interesting counterplay, and it'll be a very interesting rule to see whether this rule impacts any of the matches in particular. So with that, given the way the element draft is played, there's no particular advantage for a given player what group they're in other than who their opponents are. Also, due to some situations in Group B of the previous round, there is an additional spot that was up for grabs, and that spot was played for by Odie Oddson, Vangelios, and Mr. Paper, who finished 5th in my group, Group C, in the previous round. That spot was won by Vangelios, so you will see his name in here as one of 5 names coming from the old Group D, and only 3 players advanced from the old Group B. So with that, we'll begin with Group A, which this time around is my group. My opponents in this group are Blacksmith, Regiptic, and Root Ranger. This is a very interesting group to find myself in, because both Blacksmith and Root Ranger are the 2 players who are my formal mentors in the Elements mentoring system, and to have both of them in my group is interesting. Both of them know my tendencies, at least to some extent, from the time they spent mentoring me, and I obviously have a lot of respect for both of them, given that I have previously asked both of them to mentor me, and I expect the matches to be fairly exciting. Not all of my player tendencies, of course, are the same as during my mentoring process. player tendencies do change over time, but that is something that I'll at least have to be thinking about to some extent. Regiptic is a player who is most associated with the darkness element, and has been a fairly strong player overall. He had a very strong performance in the Sacrifice event relatively recently, and he is a player that definitely will need to be watched out for as well. I don't know him as well as I know the other two players in my group, but I expect the match to be interesting regardless. Moving on to Group B, the defending world champion Afterenti is in this group. Afterenti struggled a little bit in the first round, but still managed to scrape his way through. Cheesy111 was one of the players who was in my group in the past round. He's the defending champion of BL. He had an okay time in the first round. He ended up level with me in our match. He inadvertently used entropy 3 times. I'm not sure he quite possibly had the advantage in our match up until that point. His overall match record ended up being 2-3, and we were tied for the 3rd place position in our group. But I definitely think that he's a strong player. But then next we come to Deuce22, who is the Grandmaster, 3-time Master of Ether, 3-time Champion of War, current War Master. He is one of the strongest active players, and for both him and Afterenti to be in the same group means that either of the other two players will have to perform very, very well to advance out of this group. And finally we come to Surprex, who along with Deuce is one of the current War Masters. I don't know as much about Surprex's specific play, though the times I've played against him he's been a reasonably formidable opponent, and I think that he definitely has the chance to compete in this group, but I think that Afterenti and Deuce should be seen as the favorites in the group, but both Cheesy and Surprex certainly should be seen as having a decent chance to advance to the round of 8. Next we come to Group C, which features Megron, Trashduke, Xnoise, and Zawad X. Megron is the current Master of Earth, and he had some interesting games in the previous round. He was one of the players advancing from Group B. His first round performance was not especially strong, but he did reasonably well, and I know him to be a competent player overall. He personally has the head-to-head advantage over me in our matches, and though I would consider myself one of the lower-seeded players still remaining in the field, so that's not actually saying that much, but I do have a reasonably high opinion of Megron as a player, and I think that he is a player who has the potential to advance deeper into the tournament, but I think that he has a fairly rough draw here. We next come to Trashduke, who, I've said this quite a few times, but was a relatively unheralded player before the start of the World Championships. He was controversially drafted early and expensively by Team Gravity in the war, and went on to be one of the strongest players in Team Gravity. But even then, he was not especially high profile. However, he proceeded to obliterate, with a 4-0 match record, his group in qualifying for the World Championships, and win his field of 24 proper, and then proceeded to take an outright first place with a 4-1 match record and 14 game wins in my group of the previous round. He beat me 3 games to 2. That was the match in which I my Mono Ether in the fourth game at a 2-1 deficit, took the game, but dropped game 5 playing Sor Pharaohs. Trash Duke going 4-1 and only losing to Mr. Paper in a group that contained Kalindu, Jen, Cheesy, and Mr. Paper, and even the Mr. Paper loss was 3-2, really says a lot about him as a player. And I think that Trash Duke is a very serious threat right now to any players that are in his group. He's just been performing so well against the likes of Jen and Kalindu. I mean, those are some very, very high quality players, and Trash Duke is absolutely one of the biggest rising stars of Elements right now. Xnoise is the player who absolutely dominated the most recent season of the Championship League, and his signature raw dominance is something that I think could take him pretty far into the World Championship. I'm not sure how deep his deck pool is. I've gotten the impression that he uses a relatively small rotation of decks, but that he's able to vary them enough that you can't make consistent counters to that anyway, but that his deck pools of decks he actually uses regularly might be a little smaller than some of the other players. That might give him a little bit of a problem in a format like this one, but I certainly think he's a very adaptable player. He's excellent at getting his opponent's heads and correctly yomiing them in order to set up perfect counters. So I think that he is probably should be regarded as the strongest player in this group. I'm not sure whether he will in fact win the group. I actually think that all 4 players in this group are very, very close in terms of who is most likely to advance and who is most likely not to. But I think that Xnoise, just based on his sheer dominance in the 2014 Championship League, needs to be regarded as a massive, massive threat. Next, we come to Zawadex. And Zawadex is one of the youngest players overall. He's reasonably experienced, but just in terms of age, he is one of the youngest players. And he has a reputation as a little bit of a giant killer. Zawadex defeated Jen in the Sacrifice event and eliminated Jen from Heir of the False Gods. Zawadex has had extremely strong wins in Battle League, beating the majority of the top players at least 1 or 2 times. This doesn't necessarily mean that he is as consistent as he needs to be to actually win the Battle League event overall, but he, much like I said with Xnoise, has a really good ability of getting in his opponent's heads and correctly yomiing them and playing perfect counters. And because of his ability to do that, he's gotten a disproportionate number of wins over top players, and the World Championship is obviously an event that's full of top players. So if Zawadex can continue his giant killing ways, I mean, he has really 3 giants in this group right now. Megron, like I said, Master of Earth, very strong player. Trash Duke, the biggest rising star, and Xnoise, the dominant champion of the most recent season of CL. So this looks like Zawadex is right at home. If I had to make a prediction, I would probably say that Xnoise and Trash Duke are the 2 most likely to make it out, but that's nothing against the other 2 players in this group. I really think that this group is by far the closest of the groups, and by far the hardest to call. And finally, we'll move on to the group of death in the round, Group D. Group D has Dragon's Demesne and Jenny, the 2 players who have made the top 8 of both of the previous Elements World Championships. They're the only 2 players who overlapped in the top 8 of the 2 previous World Championships. And they are very, very strong players. Jen finished second place in my group in the previous round, 3-2 match result overall, despite a 0-3 loss to the Duke. Dragon's Demesne consistently at the top of both leagues, Battle and Championship. Very strong player who did reasonably well as Gravity's lieutenant despite the struggles that Gravity had in war. Dragon's Demesne has a reputation as a very, very strong deck builder, who can build fairly consistent decks in his distinctive style for basically any meta and still make them able to withstand competition. And I think that is definitely something to be said in his favor. And then on the group continuing, we have Vangelios, who, due to some technical problems, was initially going to be eliminated from the first round, but played his way in through the spot that became open. He's Master of Fire, and he stomped Odie Odson and beat Mr. Paper in order to get this spot, and he certainly shouldn't be disregarded. But I'm not sure how well he'll be able to stand up against the likes of Dragon's Demesne and Jenny. And finally, we have World Wide Web 3, who, until Trash Duke's recent success, I would have considered the biggest rising star of Elements. He's a relatively new player, started playing around the same time that I did, and he has had a large amount of success in both the Battle and Championship leagues. He's been towards the top of both leagues quite a lot, and has just generally played pretty well. He's drawn comparisons actually specifically to Dragon's Demesne in his playing style, and I'm curious to see how those two players will match up against each other. I think that Dragon's Demesne, as the more experienced player and the player with a very, very large number of wins